when Israel makes its way into the Promised Land, the Tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant that had been like the center of their religious and spiritual life is no longer the center of their life. The Tabernacle, the Ark, is off somewhere else, someplace in Shiloh, and the people are conquering the land, and then they're setting up cities, and David becomes king, and he establishes Jerusalem as the capital city. David builds himself a great palace, and then he realizes that he is living in a house, a palace with a roof, and the ark of God, upon which the presence of God dwells, is off in a tent. And he's like, this isn't right. And so we need to rectify this. He then begins to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And there's an incident. There's a man named Uzzah who was walking alongside the cart that was carrying the ark. And I guess the cart hit a pothole or something, because the cart jostled, which meant the Ark of the Covenant jostled. And so Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark, and boom, he is obliterated. He was just trying to help. He wasn't trying to be a problem. He wasn't trying to be sacrilegious. He was literally just trying to help. But he's obliterated nonetheless. It kind of shows the power and the holiness of this ark. But it really distressed David. He's like, this is not right. He's upset. He's angry with God for this thing. And he's worried about bringing this dangerous object into his city. And so he leaves it outside for a bit. He does want a temple, but it would not be on him to build it. It would be on his son Solomon. And Solomon would erect a temple. And it was designed much in the same way as the tabernacle in the wilderness. There was an outer courtyard into which all of Israel could go. In that outer courtyard, there was an altar, and there was a basin of water called the sea. But then instead of a tent structure, there was an actual building structure made of stone and wood and gold. And in that structure, there were two main rooms. There was an larger outer sanctum called the holy place, and in that was the altar of incense, the table of bread, and the candelabra. And then there was the Holy of Holies, which again is shaped like a cube. Its width, length, and height are all equidistant. In that Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant and the presence of God, which rested on the mercy seat. Anyone could go into the courtyard, only priests could go into the holy place, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and then only one day of year, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Again, God dwells with God's people. And the word that is used oftentimes in the Old Testament to describe the temple is the house. It's the house of the Lord. Of course, it does not confine God. God is not just bound there. God fills the universe and everything in it. But God is particularly right there, dwelling with God's people. That temple stands there for hundreds of years. It is eventually destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians when they come and destroy Jerusalem. This is a terrible event. It is seen as absolutely cataclysmic. Not only do the Israelites lose their freedom and lose their homeland, but they also lose the temple, the house of God. 70 to 100 years later, the temple is rebuilt. We call this temple the Second Temple, and the whole period that it exists is called the Second Temple period of Judaism. Judaism has like different stages, and this is the Second Temple period. This is the period that Jesus lived. Jesus was a Second Temple Jew. Jesus went to the temple multiple times. We see him in the gospel honoring the temple and honoring the presence of God in the temple. He gets really upset when people are selling things and turning the temple into a place of commerce instead of a place of prayer. And he goes in and he overturns the tables and says, my Father's house is a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. That temple that he knew, the Second Temple, had a huge renovation. A few decades before Jesus was born, by King Herod. Yeah, that King Herod, the same king who had all of the male children of Bethlehem and surrounding region killed. That Herod was a builder. He built lots of things, and one of the things he did was he turned the temple into this absolute spectacle. It was considered to be one of the great wonders of the ancient world and one of the most fabulous temples in the ancient world. He expanded it greatly. That was the temple that Jesus knew. That temple would be destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And to this day, it has not been rebuilt. And it's kind of a big thing. I mean, there's a lot of, not all, but a lot of Jewish people who would like to see the temple rebuilt. The only problem is the Temple Mount is controlled by the Muslims, and on there is the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, these incredibly considered to be holy places for the Muslim faith. And so, to tear something down like that and to rebuild a temple, it would require World War III. So that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. The temple, as it was constructed, was a temple like any other in the ancient Near East. If you were a visitor from some other ancient Near East culture or people, and you walked into Jerusalem and you saw the temple, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's a temple. The temple structure itself had two columns, which flanked the main door into the temple. It was called, the two columns had names. They were Yakin and Boaz. And then, of course, the outer sanctum and the inner sanctum, and so many other ancient temples in the ancient world were formed just like this: two columns, an outer sanctum, and an inner sanctum. In New York City, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a large exhibit called the Temple of Dendur, where they literally moved a temple from ancient Egypt into New York City, literally stone by stone. They were going to flood that valley, and so in order to save the temple, they took it down and they said, like, who wants it? And New York City wanted it, and so it's there. You can go there, and I've been there so many times. I used to write sermons sitting in the outer court of that temple, and then inside the outer court, there's a building. The building has two columns flanking the door, and there's an outer sanctum and there's an inner sanctum. Interestingly, that temple was a pagan temple when it was constructed, was then turned into a Christian church in Egypt. And the guys that I'm staying with here, these Coptic Orthodox monks, it would have been the Coptic Orthodox Christians that would have used that building as a Christian church those many years ago. But the point is, temples were constructed like this. There really would have been nothing all that strange or different between the Jerusalem temple and other ancient temples, except for the fact that at the center of the temple, at the center of the holy place, was not an idol. There was no statue to a god. It was simply a space, an empty space, a seemingly empty space in which the presence of God dwelt. When the temple is destroyed that second time by the Romans, and the Romans come back and they ground the Temple Mount down. They take feet off the top of the Temple Mount so that literally nothing remains. The only thing that remains to this day is an outer wall of the temple that was not part of the building itself. It was part of one of the outer courts. And that's called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, where you might have seen Jewish people go and stick prayers in between the stones. It's called the Wailing Wall because Jews bewail the fact that their temple is gone, because it signified to us, it housed the presence of God, and it's not there anymore. With all of this talk about God wanting to be with us and God dwelling with us, and um, and the engine of our faith not being knowing things about God, but knowing God and experiencing God, there is a problem, and it's the problem of the experience of the absence of God. As a priest, I've had so many people sit in my office and say to me, God seems so far away. And sometimes they've had experiences of God prior, like they felt close to God and now they don't, or sometimes they just never had an experience of God. And then there are people who come in and they are sick, deeply sick, or they are mourning the death of someone, or their life has been utterly turned upside down, and they just so want to feel the peace which comes with the presence of God, and they just feel alone and empty. The experience of the absence of God is not a modern one. The experience of the absence of God is it's a well-worn experience, and we see it over and over again in the scriptures. In Psalm 88, we find, "O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? You have taken me from my friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend." In Lamentations 5, this was written while the Israelites were living after the destruction of the first temple. "Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days?" Maybe the most famous prayer of the absence of God is Psalm 22, which is not just in Psalm 22, it is also the words that Jesus prays on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" These are just three examples of the many times in the scriptures. In the scriptures, it talks about God being absent, or God feeling like God is like so far away. And not only is that experience experienced by the psalmist and by Job and by Jonah and so many others, but it's also experienced by Jesus, who we believe is God, that Jesus is God incarnate, and yet God in Jesus feels like God has forsaken him. When we experience the absence of God, ironically, we are not alone. We feel alone. We feel completely isolated. But that experience puts us in the company of a great many people and a great many holy people, including the company of Jesus, who prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The ancient desert fathers and mothers who literally lived in the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 4th and 5th centuries, and the monks I'm staying with here at this monastery are the spiritual children of those desert fathers and mothers. They made a lot of the experience of the absence of God, and the desert being not just a physical place, but the desert being a condition of the soul. They talked about it, one, as as a human experience, like we experience the absence of God. But just because we experience the absence of God does not mean that God is absent from us. They knew that even though we experience God being so far from us, that God actually isn't all that far from us. They also talk about the experience of the absence of God as formative. It's one of the things that forms a deep and mature faith. That, you know, the Christian faith is not just all like excitement and happy and clappy and everything's wonderful, but sometimes our inner desert, our inner experience of desolation is a crucible in which faith can thrive. For it's in that crucible that we might hear God, not in the pyrotechnic, as we talked about in the last session, but experience God in the small. It also, the spiritual desert fathers and mothers talk about the absence of God as something that needs to be endured, that we keep going. There was a ancient desert father who was approached by a Christian and went to the desert father and said, "Oh, Father, I have fallen in my faith." And the desert father says, "Rise, get up." And he goes, "I did, but then I fell again." And he said, desert father says, "Well, rise again." And the man says, "Well, how many times do I have to get up?" And the desert father says, "Until you breathe no more." Life is constantly about getting up and lifting our eyes to see the God who actually is around us. Even though we might pray the same words that Jesus prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you forsaken me in this moment? Why am I stricken with this disease? Why am I mourning this person that I love? Why does my life feel totally upside down? Why are you not with me? Why do I not experience that peace? We get up. And even if we don't experience the presence of God in our heart and in our emotions, to remember in that silence and in that desolation that God is there. And that peace is there if we just still ourselves and open our eyes and listen.